Okay. All right. Welcome everyone to our second composting workshop for spring of 2021. I'm Beth Callistad with the City of Northfield. And in just a moment, I'll be turning things over to our presenter, Helen Forsyth from Northfield Curbside Composting. But before I do that, a couple quick housekeeping things. So as I just mentioned, we are recording the presentation and this will be available shortly, within a few days after we get the recording done on the city website. We're putting these with the calendar in pieces for each of the sessions, and they'll be available through our YouTube channel and Northfield Public Broadcasting eventually as well. We do ask that participants stay muted when the presentation is happening. We will pause for questions periodically, and you are welcome to write a question in the chat if you would like to do that. And the chat feature probably is down in the bottom center of your screen, the little word bubble, but you are welcome to just raise your hand and ask a question when we get to those stopping points as well. We will send out a bit of a follow-up, kind of a take-home sheet probably later tomorrow to everyone, and we'll try to answer some questions. I know I still have a few questions. I finally got everything I think figured out from the last session, and so the Q&A on that, you'll get the benefit of having those questions too, because I think we'll send it to everybody that registered. And yeah, so we'll send that email out hopefully tomorrow or within the next day. And that I think is pretty much it for the housekeeping pieces. So it's my pleasure to introduce Helen. She is one of the worker owners at Northfield Curbside Composting and has been a long-time environmental advocate and cheerleader in Northfield. And Helen is going to share with us tonight about backyard composting. And I'm going to try to run the presentation side of things. So Helen, I'll let you get started while I pull the presentation up.
All right. Thanks so much, Beth. And thank you all so much for taking some time on this really beautiful evening we're having to talk about backyard composting. All right, excellent. Yep, so again, we're talking about at-home composting in your backyard and vermiculture. So we'll dive right in here. Thank you to Jan Shoger. Jan Shoger is a Northfield resident who helped to make these workshops possible. My name is Helen Forsyth, as Beth so nicely introduced, and some of the materials that we will be using tonight were compiled by Nell Gerke, and we're pretty excited about these workshops as a collaboration between the City of Northfield and Northfield Curbside Compost. So if you missed it last week, we talked about recycling and composting in Northfield, different options for both of those things. So as Beth said, we're going to be sending out some follow-up resources that were a lot of questions primarily about recycling in Northfield. There's a lot to keep track of when it comes to recycling. And if you missed that, you can access a recording on the YouTube channel. Coming up next week, this same time on Monday, April 12th, we'll be talking about compost communication. So if you are interested in kind of talking to your friends or your neighbors or your family members about why compost matters, we're going to be chatting about kind of how to do that next week. Yep, and again, if you missed one, don't worry, because they are recorded and will be available on the YouTube channel. So the agenda for today, we're going to talk about why does composting matter. For those of you who were here last week, that might be a little bit of a review, but it's important to kind of center why this matters. Then we're going to talk about some things to keep in mind as you embark on a backyard composting journey. Then we're going to talk about backyard compost. We're going to talk about vermicompost, and we're going to talk about some benefits and uses, and then we'll close. Throughout the presentation, we'll have some opportunities for questions. So if you think of them, save them, and then I'll invite them at different points through the presentation. All right, so would love to hear from folks. If you're welcome to unmute or put it in the chat. What are you hoping to learn tonight?
I'm hoping to learn about the process of composting and how to do it, what to do, what not to do. Thanks.
Excellent. Yep.
I'd like to know about the differences between backyard composting and letting the city do it, the pros and cons either way.
Okay, cool. I will try to touch on that.
I'd like to learn what goes into a backyard composting. Can I put in all my watermelon? Can I put in, just what can go into a backyard composting, or is it only yard debris? I'm not clear.
Excellent. Yes, we will definitely get to that. Okay, yeah, a question of where can I buy worms for my small compost bin, not Amazon. All right. That I'll have to check my notes. That may be something that Beth and I have to follow up on, but we'll see. All right. Well, thank you all for chiming in on what you're hoping to learn. Hopefully we will cover everything. And if there's something that we don't cover, by all means, we will try to follow up with an answer to all of these different questions. All right, and I'm just doing a little bit of toggling on my screen here, so bear with me. Okay, great. So jumping into our content here, a little bit about why does composting matter? So 2 key points here for me. One is that when organic waste, which is basically another word for, your fruits and vegetables and all that stuff that can break down in the compost process, when that waste goes into the landfill, it's a contributor to pollution and climate change. It's not able to break down properly because it doesn't have enough access to oxygen. So it breaks down in a way that's called anaerobic. And that means that it releases methane into the atmosphere. Methane is a key contributor to climate change. Another key point here is the less bulk that we have going to the landfill means that we have fewer landfills that need to be constructed and maintained. And we can go to the next slide. So this slide here shows a little bit more of what I was talking about with compost not being able to break down properly. This slide kind of shows when you've got your food waste mixed in with your plastics and all these other things that go into a landfill. It's just not able to do all the different chemical processes necessary to properly break down into soil. And so you've got the methane emissions. Then another problem that you can sometimes see with organic matter going into the landfill is leachate. So that's kind of the juices, the waters that can run off from the landfill. And there's a lot of different mechanisms that landfills put in place to stop that from happening. But nonetheless, sometimes it is still a problem. And we can go to the next slide. So we've got all these reasons that when organic material going into the landfill is a problem, organic material can be a really important resource when we keep that out of the landfill. So as I'm sure you all are aware of to some degree since you're here at this workshop, compost is an important resource when it comes to soil health and fertility if it is broken down properly. So it can be used in gardens, in landscapes and farms, and all these different things. So it's really a pretty valuable resource. So when it comes to backyard composting, there's 3 things that you want to keep in mind. You're not going to be an expert right away. So just like anything in life, you got to practice and learn over time. So be patient with yourself. Experiment. So I'm going to give you a whole bunch of tips and pointers, but there's really, there's a lot of ways to do this, and there's a lot of room for experimentation. All right, this one's important. So compost piles will always yield compost. How fast that happens depends on us. You could maybe also add how stinky that happens. Depends on us. So yeah, compost is a really natural process. It's kind of what your food waste wants to do. And there's a lot of things that we can do to help it along. But the default is that it'll probably compost. So here we are, we're going to talk about first backyard compost. So bin construction, there's a lot of different ways to construct a bin. Some recommendations is 3 to 5 feet in diameter. And anything bigger than 5 feet just kind of gets a little bit difficult to manage and turn. As you're thinking about your bin construction, you want to keep in mind that there should be airflow on the bottom, while also allowing organisms from the earth to come into your pile. So you don't want to necessarily seal off the bottom of your backyard compost pile. So materials, you can use chicken wire like we've got pictured here. You can use wooden pallets, that's pretty popular, and we've also got that pictured there. Both of those are really good options because they allow for a lot of airflow. Again, kind of referencing back to why compost does not break down in the landfill, that airflow and oxygen piece is really important to good compost. You can also make bins out of like bricks or cinder blocks, but it's not recommended because, again, doesn't offer much airflow. One recommendation on placement of your bin is you don't want to put it like right next to a shed or something like that, because your compost pile might kind of eat into whatever permanent structure it's right next to. So give it a little bit of space from other existing structures. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so a couple more things to keep in mind as you're deciding where you want to place your bin. Keep in mind your space. So yeah, again, not too close to existing buildings, and then sun versus shade. There's not a really set recommendation for how much sunlight your pile should be getting. The sun will dry out the pile more quickly. So if you have a pile that's, you know, just fully indirect sunlight, it just might mean you need to water it a little more often. But that will also lengthen the season that your pile can be active. So you want to just kind of weigh those things as you're thinking about where you want to put your pile. One more consideration as far as space is if you're planning to turn your pile, you'll just need to think about how, you know, if you're able to like get in there and do that, the space to do so. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so there's kind of 4 key components that you need in your pile for good compost. You need airflow, like we've talked about. You need the proper amount of water, which we'll get into in a little more detail a little later. You need a proper carbon source, and carbon in this case is referring to things like sticks, leaves, kind of on the more yard waste side of things. And then you need nitrogen, which is more food scraps. So things pictured here like your onions and carrot tops and all that type of thing. So as we've touched on a little bit, airflow is really important. When there's not enough oxygen, different bacteria take over the process. Methane gets released. That is not good. And this also relates to like how hot the pile is able to get. So we want our piles to kind of cook in order to kill off the bacteria that we don't want. And so, yeah, airflow is a really important part of that. Yes, then so water, you want your pile to be as damp as a wrung out sponge. So if you were to reach your hand in and pick up a handful and give it a little squeeze, you want a little bit of water to be there. And this is because the bacteria and other microorganisms need a little bit of moisture in order to move around. Otherwise, yeah, they're not able to do what they need to do. So this is kind of a fun illustration that shows a bunch of different micro and macroorganisms that are involved in the compost process. There's a ton of different organisms that are at work when you have a properly managed compost pile. So we've got these different kind of levels in this illustration. The first level, consumers in blue, will eat the compost, and then some of them will be eaten by secondary consumers, which we show in the blue and green color, which then in turn get eaten by the green group. And so by eating and then excreting the material in the pile, that's how your food scraps and garden scraps are turned into soil. So I think that that is pretty cool. And we can move on to the next slide. All right, so then getting a little more into this temperature piece. As the bacteria work, they release carbon dioxide and the energy heats up the pile. Now, I say that the pile releases carbon dioxide, and in this case, we're talking about like the natural carbon cycle and not an undue amount of carbon dioxide. So definitely want to point that out as I say that. And so, yeah, as those different organisms are doing their work, the pile heats up. And we can go to the next slide. So you'll want to check the temperature of your pile sometimes. And there's a number of different ways that you can do this. You can buy what's called a compost probe, which is available at most garden stores. You can also just insert a metal rod in there and then take it out and feel it with your hands. If it's warm, that's good. That's really all you need. Or if you're really adventurous, you can just stick your hand right in your pile and see how it feels. The bottom line is you want your pile to be warm. More specifically than that, it's for your backyard pile doesn't matter a whole lot. You're not working with a whole lot of mass, so it's probably not going to get too hot. But you just want to check that it's warm. And we can go on to the next. All right. Yes. So getting to this question of what can go in a compost pile. So one rule that we kind of use is if it grows, it goes. So all of your food scraps, your yard waste, that type of thing can go in your pile. There is a little bit of speculation about oak leaves and pine needles. With those, just make sure with the pine needles that they are small enough, and maybe let your pine needles, if you're trying to compost those, let them sit for a season before you add them to the pile. Okay, so some things that should be kept out of a backyard compost pile. Do not put treated lumber into your pile. Do not use manure from meat eaters. There's pathogens that can muck up your process. Wood ash and sawdust are also not things you want to put in there because those can inhibit the airflow. So other things like oil and fat, you don't want to put those in there. They have the potential to suffocate microorganisms that are living in the pile. And you don't want to put meat or dairy, partially because they are key pests are very interested in those items. And so in order to kind of keep pests out of your pile, it's a good idea to not have either of those. And a good rule of thumb is when in doubt, leave it out. It's better to throw things in the trash or find other ways to dispose of things than it is to disrupt your compost pile. I will say briefly that if you are interested in having a backyard pile and still want to be composting like meat and dairy and a couple other things that you shouldn't compost in your backyard pile, we do offer a curbside pickup service that you can subscribe to, or there's a couple of drop sites in Northfield that you can bring those products to. All right, so getting a little more into what I was mentioning about carbon and nitrogen. So carbon, again, is often referred to as brown material because often it is brown, so dried leaves or sticks. And all of those things decay a little more slowly than your nitrogen-rich material. And so carbon needs to be added to the pile less frequently. Nitrogen, that's again, all of your food scraps, your vegetables, your kitchen waste, as well as fresh lawn scraps. So if you've got, your freshly cut grass clippings, those would be considered nitrogen if they're fresh. And so all of those things decay pretty rapidly. So you'll want to be adding those to your pile more frequently than the brown material. All right, so then we get a little bit into the ratios. And so in theory, you want to have a ratio of 30 to 1, 30 carbon and 1 nitrogen. But that's really not very practical for backyard composting. So in backyard composting, we want it to
I need to
I
go
think
home
somebody
and
maybe
put
has
some
an
clothes
ad
in the
playing.
wash machine and some clothes in the dryer.
Okay, thank you. Not sure what happened there, but thanks to whoever maybe muted or something. All right. So for your backyard pile, you should aim for 3 to 1. So a ratio of 3 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. And so for every 3 handfuls of brown material, you want to add a handful of green. This translates to about 1 to 1 by weight. Your nitrogen materials are much heavier and a lot of times have a lot more water than your carbon material. So there's a couple different ways that you can think about that ratio. You can like use 5-gallon buckets and fill 5-gallon buckets with your carbon, and then three of those and then 1 of nitrogen or that type of thing. But basically, if you're thinking about that ratio, you're probably pretty good. You just want more carbon than nitrogen. And again, it's a little tricky because the nitrogen is heavier. And yeah, thank you for that note, Beth. This info will be in your handout. So if you're like, I can't keep up with all these things, don't worry, we have a resource. Yeah. All right, so let's see here. We can go. Okay, so the building of your pile. We're gonna share a couple examples of how you can build your pile. For the purpose of this example, we're going to assume that you are using chicken wire bins. So we'll want to start with material that'll allow for airflow on the bottom. And then we'll add some brown material. Then we'll add water to that brown material. And then we'll use some kind of compost starter. So this could be finished compost or manure specifically from an herbivore. So you can, I don't know if I made that distinction earlier, you can use manure from herbivores, just not manure from animals that are like eating meat. All right, and you can pick up compost starter from most garden stores. And I would say the compost starter, it's kind of a bonus. Like if you've got access to it, or if you're feeling motivated, you should totally do it. It's not a big deal if you don't have it. Okay, so then next in your pile, you'll want to add your green material, which again is your nitrogen. And then you'll repeat this process as many times as you need and cover with brown material. We'll always want to top the piles with brown material since that is really helpful for keeping critters away. So yes, and when you're adding green material, another tip is to put the kitchen waste in the center of the pile, just kind of dig it out a little bit and then put your brown waste back over the top. Again, just helps with critters. Okay, I think there was something in the chat I missed. I've heard folks can use a can of beer for starter. That's great. I haven't heard that, but sounds worth a try. Jean, do you want to say any more about what you've heard about that?
Well, I have heard folks just say, well, I go out every week or so and I pour a can of beer over the top of it because it has yeast in it. and yeast starts bubbling. And I thought, well, is that it's both wet water and yeasty and hoppy. So I didn't know if that was sort of acceptable or just a way to get rid of the beer. I don't know. I don't know.
Thank you for sharing. This is not something that I've heard of before. Does anybody else have experience or have heard of this?
I'm just reading it. Also, beer has some carbon in it. So it's good for that reason, evidently. The yeast is nitrogen rich. So I'm looking on the internet here. I'll put it in the chat.
Oh, wow.
Excellent. Thanks, Matt. All right. Yeah, thank you for that group participation on that piece. That is interesting, and I had not heard that before. I think we can go to the next slide, Beth. Okay, so yeah, I should have waited to talk about the buckets until we actually have this slide here. So the bucket method, this works well if you have a bunch of food waste handy. Maybe after a winter of keeping things in your freezer or whatever. So you can think of it as you'll be tossing in 2 buckets of brown material, and then you'll do a scoop of the nitrogen-rich material. And then, nitrogen-rich like compost starter or manure. And then you'll add some of your green material and then buckets of brown material and just repeat until you're out of materials. And, you know, we've got this slide that kind of lays that out. We'll be sending out this presentation. So if you're the type of person who wants to kind of measure things out, if you've got some spare 5-gallon buckets laying around, this might be something for you to try out. All right, so a question of when should you turn your pile? You should turn your pile to increase aeration and mix the material around and rotate out the finished material. So sometimes you'll build a pile and turn it right away. You can also build a pile and then wait to turn it. If you're getting some smells from your pile, some like bad smells, this could mean that it's gone anaerobic. So again, that it's like not having enough oxygen circulating through it. And in that case, you'll want to turn it. Otherwise, if your compost seems to be doing pretty well, it's not smelling too funky, 1 to 2 times a month to every 6 weeks will be sufficient. So you really don't need to turn it a whole lot. The other thing is if you are checking the temperature of your pile and you notice that it's cooling off, you might want to give it a day or 2 to turn the pile. And you'll want to turn the pile top to bottom and inside out. So think about both of those things as you're turning your pile. And we can go to the next slide. All right, so I touched on this a little bit earlier. When adding to the pile, you'll want to dig out the center and add the new material there. If it looks like the material you dug out is kind of at the end of its process, you can totally leave that on the outside of the pile. When you're adding material and completely turning the pile, you can count finished compost as brown material as you're building it back up. And you want to make sure you're rotating material. So naturally, the material at the center of the compost will finish sooner than the material on the outside of the compost. So yeah, you'll want to dig it out. Finishing the compost. So you will cover and let it sit for 2 to 3 months is ideal. And you'll know that it's finished when everything looks like dirt. You shouldn't be able to recognize the things that you originally put in there. So if you're seeing eggshells or coffee filters or whatever, it's not quite ready. So then you'll cover the pile with a tarp or whatever else you've got and let it sit for 2 to 3 months to cure. And you'll want to make sure that you water that periodically so that it doesn't dry out. Okay, and I'm seeing some questions in the chat. Beth's asking, how does turning the pile affect the layers? So the layers are really something that you want to be conscious of when you start. But as you're turning the pile, you don't have to be super thoughtful about the layers. You've done a good job from the beginning. And as you're adding things to your pile, you still want to be thinking about your ratios. Do I need to be adding some more brown waste and that type of thing? Okay, mentioned eggshells, okay to add them to your compost. That's a great question. I think so. I've had pretty good luck with eggshells, but I totally also welcome if anybody else has experience otherwise. They can be kind of one of those things that keeps the pile going a little longer than some of your more quickly broken down materials. Does anybody else want to weigh in on the eggshells question? All right, if not, we can keep on rolling. Okay, so then this question of troubleshooting backyard smells. So if you are getting a rotten smell, it's probably gone anaerobic, which either means too much water or not enough air. So if there's too much water, you may just have to wait for the pile to dry out. Maybe if there's a lot of rainfall, you could be covering your compost pile with a tarp to keep some of that rainwater out. And then, as we talked about, if there's not enough airflow, you'll want to kind of break up any clumps of material that are blocking the airflow and turn your pile, just like we've talked about. Another possibility with kind of ammonia smells is that there's too much nitrogen. So there you can either take out some of that nutrient-rich material or add more carbon. All right, I think we can go. Okay, we've got some more questions here. Okay, read somewhere not to add onion peels or garlic after crushing it. Does that matter? I am not sure. I have not encountered that. Has anybody else had read about that or had problems with that in their own piles? If not, we can totally follow up on that in our follow-up email. So thank you for that question. And in general, thank you all for chiming in on the chat with questions. Okay, we have Holly Fisher always adds onion peels. Great to hear. Okay, and yeah, actually, I'll more formally pause right here for questions about backyard compost because we're going to move into some vermicompost in a moment. So would love to hear other people's questions about backyard compost.
Someone asked about the winter season and the freezing.
Yes, winter is a big deal in Minnesota. So a lot of times with a backyard pile, there's just not enough material to keep things at adequate temperatures to keep doing the compost process. So a lot of times your pile is not actively decomposing in the winter time. And people have different ways of dealing with that. You can still be adding things to your pile and just keeping in mind those ratios and just knowing that nothing's going to happen until the temperatures rise a little bit. Another thing that I'll offer is we do have a number of subscribers to Northfield Curbside Compost who have backyard piles, but just use our service for 3 to 5 months in the winter time when they know that their piles aren't doing their jobs.
Helen, this is Jean Wakely again. I've seen people buy these very expensive black bins that you crank around, and they put them in the sun and crank them around. It's sounds like an easy way to stir things, but I worry about whether or not they're getting airflow. And I know that the black bin is supposed to soak up the heat and all that kind of stuff. What do you know about those in your experience?
That's a great question, Jean. I don't have personal experience with those, so I'm curious if any of our participants here have experience with those to share.
I have used that before. I like my tumbler. It wasn't that expensive, and there's slots in them that allow for the airflow. Things that it doesn't account for that's been mentioned is like the earth contact, allowing like other organisms to come in and out of. But I like my tumbler, so I think it's pretty good. Yeah.
This is Richard. I have a black bin. It's but it's not a tumbler, and it likes to be raked and, you know, messed with quite a bit. And there are some airflow places down at the bottom where there are inserts you can take up to let the compost come out when it's done, in principle. But one reason I'm here is to try to improve what I'm doing. So.
All right. Thank you both for weighing in on bins. Does anybody else have experience with kind of the closed black bins and maybe with the crank option as well? Or would also welcome any other questions. All right. Well, if you do think of anything, pop it in the chat, or we'll have another at the end for further questions. So we will jump into some conversation about vermicompost. And what vermicompost is worm composting. So instead of dealing with lots of bacteria that you can't see and trying to get the carbon and nitrogen ratio right, you're more relying on worms to eat the waste and excrete the castings, which make great compost. So we can go to, next slide. So worms like things to be 55 to 77 degrees, and the location should be dark and quiet. And you can do this indoors or outdoors. If you're going to do it outdoors, you'll just need to, in this state, insulate your bin for the winter time. And we can go to the next one. So some options for bin construction. You can build a bin or you can buy one. If you're constructing one on your own, you can make it out of wood or plastic. Plastic totes with some modifications make perfectly good worm bins. You'll just be sure to aerate the sides and the bottom, and you should place a tray under the bin to catch any excess water that might happen. And okay, so a question of what worms do you use? You don't want to just use the ones from your garden because those ones tend to live quite deep in the soil. You'll want to use red wigglers. There we go. And they are more of a surface worm, so they're better suited to living in kind of a bin situation. And you'll want to order 1 to 2 pounds of worms for every 1 pound of food that you add daily. And before buying worms, you should measure your waste for about 2 weeks to get an accurate measurement. So some options for what we call bedding material. All these materials, so newspaper, egg cartons, paper bags, plain cardboard, or old leaves, all of those would make good bedding, and all of that will be in your take-home booklet. So any of those materials should be kind of ripped or cut up into small pieces, and you should make them a little bit damp. When you're filling the bin, the bedding should make up 1/3 to 1/2 of the area in the bin. And you're going to want to aerate the pile, so you'll just kind of toss it like a salad. When you can and can't add to a worm pile, sorry, what you can and can't add to a worm pile, this is where somebody mentioned onions in backyard compost. Not sure if that's a problem. Definitely is a problem in vermicompost. So most food scraps, totally good, but you don't want to add meat and you don't want to add onions. So as far as your pile in your bin, you'll want to fill the tray with bedding, make sure it's damp and aerated, and then you'll put about 2 handfuls of soil and some crushed eggshells. And you'll want to aerate that pile and add kitchen scraps in a thin layer. And over the top of the food scraps, you'll place another layer of bedding. So a lot of this, it's really about layers and thinking about what is in each layer. All right, so then, yeah, when you're adding things to your pile, you'll want to put it into the bedding. You don't want to necessarily just sprinkle it over the top, and you'll want to alternate kind of where you put it. So if you dig a hole for your fresh food scraps in one place one time, you'll want to kind of alternate where you're putting that in the bin. And we can go to the next slide. Excellent. Yep, so there's a couple different ways you can harvest your compost in this scenario. You can just let the pile sit without adding any food. Eventually the worms will die and your compost will be ready to use. You can just move all the castings to one side and move the food to the other, is another option for this. You can add some new food as well, and in 2 weeks, the worms will have abandoned the castings for the fresh food. And lastly, you can make kind of cone-shaped piles. In 2 weeks, the worms will move towards the bottom center to escape light, and then you can harvest the surrounding worm castings. So if you're having odors with this system, you might be adding too much food, or you might not be burying the food deep enough. And if your worms are like trying to escape your bin, the bedding is either all casting or it's too acidic. If it's too acidic, you want to add eggshells or cardboard. If you have fruit flies, bury the food deeper. If you have gnats, you'll want to add coffee grounds. And if you have mold, you'll want to replace the bedding and don't add any citrus until the mold is completely gone. And we can go to the next slide. So a couple of key differences between backyard compost and vermicompost are that backyard compost is in an open bin, unless you have one of those systems that we were just talking about. But for the most part, your backyard compost will be in an open bin. It'll be outside, all that. You can use it to break down both yard waste as well as kitchen waste. And here in Minnesota, that is fairly seasonal. With vermicompost, it is a closed bin system, and it can be done indoors, which means that for us, it can be done year round. However, in that system, you'll only be disposing of kitchen waste. All right, so I'm going to pause here for questions about vermicompost. Let's see here. So we've got a couple of comments here. So we've got something from Matt. The acids and chemicals in onion peels and citrus peels can kill worms and microorganisms. Small amounts are okay, but more strongly recommended against with vermicomposting. Yes, yep, totally true. Castings equals worm poop. Yes, that's correct. Other questions about vermicompost?
Helen, we had the question earlier about where we're purchasing the worms from. Is that something that we'll need to get back to folks on, or?
I think that would be something to get back to folks on. I'm
Okay.
just scanning my notes here to see if I've got any information about that. But yeah, I think that'll be we'll get back to you. All right. If there's no further questions about vermicompost, we can keep rolling. Oh, okay. Yep. What to do with materials that can't go in your compost pile or in your vermiculture system. So I mentioned this a little earlier. There's 3 options for things like meat, compostable plastics, dairy, and other items that you do not want to put in your home compost systems. So there's 2 different drop sites available in Northfield. There's one at the city yard waste site. There's a nice organics recycling dumpster there. There's also some of those at the city maintenance facility. And then you can also subscribe to our curbside pickup just by going to our website, northfieldcurbsidecompost.com. So those are some options for those additional materials that are compostable, but need kind of a special system in order to do so. All right, so real briefly, we'll talk about a couple of benefits of compost. So we've got some chemical benefits. Compost can balance and stabilize the pH of the soil, which is really good for plants. It can also increase the exchange capacity of these plants. So like the ability to have different chemical interactions happening and kind of build that nutrients. Compost makes the soil more negatively charged, which means it can hold more. Okay, actually, I'm going to pause right here and transparently say that the person who prepared some of these notes knows a little more about science than I do. So I'm not going to go into the detail about the chemical benefits further than that. If anybody wants to chime in who has more of a chemistry brain than I do, I totally welcome that. But yes, we can keep rolling. So I can say that compost improves soil structure. So when you add compost to sandy soils, it can increase the amount of water that's able to be held by that soil and thus make it more suitable for plant growth. When it's added to clay-like soils, it can improve the friability, which just means how easily the soil can be broken down, which means that roots are able to penetrate more deeply into the soil. It can also make a big difference for erosion. It can kind of keep soil from being blown away or washed away, which is really important for our soil health and for our rivers. So all of those benefits. So compost, this is probably pretty obvious, but it really increases the amount of organic matter in our soils. So all the different microbes, microorganisms that are doing the breaking down of the compost are now in the soil. And that's really beneficial for soil health. So uses for compost, there are many. If you're doing backyard compost, I hope that you are using compost in your garden. You can also just use it in your lawn. You can put it at the base of trees. You can use it for surface mulch or a potting mixture if you've got indoor plants. You can also make something called a compost tea, which I can share a little bit about. You'll just take a couple handfuls of compost and put it into some cheesecloth, and then you'll soak that overnight. And then you can just water your plants directly with it, or use it as kind of a spray over that. And that has been seen to have some benefits on stopping like fungal diseases on leaves and that type of thing.
So not tea for people.
Not tea for people. Yes, thank you for that clarification, Beth. We are talking about tea for your plants. Yep, yeah, there we go. Yes, so in summary of all the different things that we just went through, composting is an experiment. It will happen. And I totally encourage people to experiment and find what works for you, what works for the amount of organic waste that you create. And it sounds like we've got plenty of experienced composters here. So hopefully you're already on your way to doing this. And I think now I'll ask for any more questions.
Say, Helen, I was not able to be on last week, and I hope that this isn't, excuse me, too much of a return, but I was very curious why at the beginning of the pandemic, we used to be able to recycle our plastic bags at the grocery stores. The minute that the pandemic hit, none of the grocery stores, all of the grocery stores quit recycling plastic bags and have not resumed to do so. Do you know anything about that? And I've called the Faribault compost site on the way to Faribault, and they said they're not taking them either, just throw them away. Do you know anything about that?
I would pose that question to Matt or Beth. Do either of you have insights on that?
Oh, okay. Matt or Beth?
Last week, someone reported that I think Cub and one other are taking the bags now.
Oh, I haven't.
Target definitely takes them, but maybe they just bury them. I don't know what they do with them. Target, you can go in it's a little hard to find. It's sort of near the first check stand, sort of near where they have all the carts.
Huh.
And they don't seem to mind if you just don't buy anything and walk in with your plastic bags.
Huh.
At least
Have
I've
restarted it.
done that.
Okay, I haven't seen that. Okay, I'll look for it. Thank you.
They're
Mike?
a little bit hidden, but you don't. It's a public thing, so you can just ask. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
my guess is they were trying to just limit excess contact, and when the thing started, we weren't really sure what was good or bad or indifferent, and so I think we'll hopefully start to see that change again. And the big issue with putting them in your curbside bins is that they get tangled in the sorting machines that are used for that. But if it's a whole, if they're picking up just a box of those, then it's a different process and things. So it's not that they can't be recycled, they just can't go in the curbside collection.
Right.
piece.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
Thanks, Matt, for sharing some worm links.
Yeah, I don't think those worm sources are going to work. I think that may be dated in the domain names that
Okay,
no longer working.
check on that. I wonder if Paisley Gardens has any worms.
It was listed under, kind of an ad, so certainly was possible. Whether they still do or not.
Oh, that'd be interesting.
That's exciting. Any other questions before we wrap things up?
Can you clarify a little bit more, or some others, yard waste that goes with outdoor composting? Presumably, what don't you want for yard waste in there? I mean, presumably larger twigs and things like that, right? But leaves?
Yep, leaves are good, sticks are good. With bigger branches, you'll probably want to bring those to the yard waste site.
Right,
Or
right.
we talked about this last week, but the city does offer a yard waste pickup that you can sign up for on the city website.
Right.
Where a yard waste bin and that gets picked up. But yeah, I think the key thing there is you don't want to put like chemicals in your pile. So, if you if you've got chemicals on your lawn and then you mow your lawn and you put that right into your pile, that might not be a good idea. And then the bigger stuff. So, bigger branches, bigger, trees you don't want in there. But otherwise, it's pretty much everything else.
What about pine cones? They wouldn't work, would they? Pine cones?
Pine cones.
Yeah.
I think you should be okay with pine cones.
Really? They seem so indestructible.
They last for years.
Yeah, they last for years just sitting, you know what I mean, sitting around.
Yeah, I guess that's a great
Okay.
question. I haven't actually tried to compost
It
pine
could
cones.
be a problem. I was reading that pine needles, you should like leave them out for a year and then put them in, that otherwise they don't
Yeah.
really break down, and likewise oak leaves tend to have that problem.
What
I'm
about-
leery about putting a lot of weeds in because I'm worried about there being seeds then. So that's something that I avoid.
Yeah.
Weeds, yeah.
What about old bits from Christmas trees a year ago? For instance.
Have the city.
But that's the tree and pine needle
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I don't do this. I'm just curious what the lines would be.
Sure.
Feed
was
them to the
wondering-
goats.
I was wondering if you're putting leaves into your home compost, wouldn't you want to break them up with a lawnmower and then rake them up and put them in? I mean, get them a head start. Is that better, or still oak leaves specifically are just tough?
Yeah, from what I know, oak leaves are especially tough. It's definitely totally great to do what you're talking about, like break up the leaves, but it shouldn't be necessary.
Okay.
So how do we get the wonderful pamphlet you promised us, Helen?
That will be sent to you in an email, right, Beth?
Yes, I will email that out. It will actually probably be Wednesday.
Oh, that's
by the-
terrific. Okay.
And so we'll send that out. We'll also add it as a link to the calendar item on the city calendar of events page. So that we'll put the link to it'll be a PDF, and we'll put that there. So you can find it there, and then you'll find it in the email that we send to you. And we'll I think probably by the last session for sure, I'll make sure we have out the links to the recordings and things too. So yeah. And if you can't find anything, you can always check in with me and I'll try to get you where you need to be. So thank you very much, Helen. We really appreciate your time, and thank you everyone for your participation tonight. We hope you can join us next week. I know there's a lot of different things going on. I think the library had an event tonight too, so I was like, oh darn, I'm doing my own event. I can't come to yours. So think we appreciate your time and have a wonderful evening. Oh, Holly, do you have a question? Oh no, you're just saying, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.